The park was alive with the familiar sounds of laughter, playful screams, and the rhythmic creak of swings moving back and forth. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind where the sun bathed the world in golden warmth, and a soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Parents watched over their children from wooden benches, some chatting amongst themselves while others scrolled through their phones. Dogs barked happily as they chased frisbees, and couples strolled along the paved pathways, wrapped in quiet conversation. Keanu Reeves walked unnoticed through the park, his hands tucked into the pockets of his well-worn leather jacket. His hair, slightly tousled by the wind, framed his face, and his eyes carried the quiet thoughtfulness that so many admired. He wasn't here to be recognized. He wasn't here as a celebrity, an action star, or a Hollywood icon. He was just a man enjoying a rare, peaceful afternoon away from the cameras and flashing lights. As he walked, he observed the little moments of life unfolding around him. A father lifted his giggling daughter onto his shoulders, a group of teenagers huddled together over a phone, and an elderly couple sat on a bench, their hands intertwined in silent companionship. These were the moments he cherished, the simplicity of human connection. Then he heard it, a sharp voice, laced with cruelty. The kind of voice that cut through the innocent laughter like a jagged knife. "Come on, freak, say something. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." Keanu's steps slowed. His gaze followed the voice until he saw them. A small group of boys, no older than 12 or 13, gathered in a loose circle around a lone figure. At first, he couldn't see who they were taunting, but as he stepped closer, the crowd of bodies shifted just enough for him to catch a glimpse. The boy at the center of it all was small, almost fragile-looking, with dark, curly hair that fell over his eyes. He clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, his knuckles white, his entire body tense, as if bracing for impact. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but the other kids had formed an unspoken barrier, cutting off any chance of fleeing. Keanu felt a familiar pang in his chest. "Give him back his backpack." The taller boy hesitated, glancing around as if looking for an escape. The situation had changed in an instant. A second ago, he was in control. Now he was standing in front of a man who was legendary, not just for the movies, but for his kindness, his humility, his reputation for standing up for what's right. He swallowed hard, then shoved the backpack toward the boy with a forced scoff. "Whatever, we were just joking." Keanu didn't smile, didn't ease up. He simply held the boy's gaze for another second, long enough to make sure the message was clear, then turned his attention to the smaller boy. "You okay?" The boy nodded quickly, though his hands were still trembling as he clutched his bag. He looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze for the first time, his eyes filled with something between disbelief and awe. Keanu crouched slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "They were wrong, you know," he said, nodding toward the sketchbook. "You're not a freak. You're talented." The boy swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the book in his arms. He hesitated, then, with a shaky hand, flipped to one of the pages. It was a stunning drawing of a futuristic city, filled with towering skyscrapers, flying vehicles, and neon lights reflecting off glass surfaces. It was the kind of artwork that told a story without words, the kind that spoke of dreams and worlds yet to be explored. Keanu studied the page with genuine admiration. "This is incredible." A small smile tugged at the boy's lips, hesitant but real. You think so?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah. And you know what? The people who create worlds like this, they're the ones who change the world out here too." The boy blinked, absorbing the words as if no one had ever said anything like that to him before. By now, a small crowd had gathered. People whispered excitedly, some discreetly pulling out their phones. Keanu, however, remained focused on the boy in front of him. "You keep drawing," he said softly, "no matter what anyone says. Okay?" The boy nodded, this time with more certainty. Keanu stood up, casting one last glance toward the group of kids who had been doing the bullying. None of them met his gaze. They had already begun to step back, uncomfortable under the weight of what had just happened. Without another word, Keanu gave the boy a small nod and turned to walk away, slipping back into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. But the moment wasn't over. Not for the boy, not for the kids who had watched, and certainly not for the world. Because somewhere in that crowd, someone had been filming. And by the time the sun set on that quiet suburban park, the video of Keanu Reeves standing up for a bullied child was already on its way to going viral. The atmosphere in the park had shifted. What had once been an ordinary afternoon filled with casual conversations, laughter, and the rhythmic sounds of children playing was now tinged with an undercurrent of something unspoken, something powerful. The moment Keanu Reeves had stepped in, everything had changed. The kids who had been laughing moments ago were now eerily silent, processing the fact that they had just been called out by a man whose face they had seen in movies, whose presence alone carried a gravity they hadn't expected. The boy Leo clutched his backpack tightly against his chest. His heart still pounded from the confrontation, but the fear that had gripped him earlier was slowly being replaced by something else. Disbelief, gratitude, a strange, surreal feeling of standing at the center of a moment that felt bigger than himself. His fingers curled around the worn edges of his sketchbook, his most precious possession, now safe again. He had been humiliated just moments ago, but now the same kids who had laughed at him weren't laughing anymore. Keanu had already started walking away, blending back into the park as if he hadn't just stopped a bullying incident from escalating. He never did things for attention, never stuck around for praise. But Leo wasn't ready to let this moment slip away. His feet moved before his mind had even fully processed it, and he ran forward, reaching out. Wait, Keanu stopped. He turned, his expression soft, patient. Leo hesitated. He had no idea what to say to a man like this. He had never spoken to someone famous before, and even if he had, this wasn't just anyone. This was Keanu Reeves. The same Keanu Reeves whose movies he had watched with his dad before his parents split. The same man who had been in stories online about random acts of kindness, the kind of stories people doubted were real. Until now. Keanu tilted his head slightly, waiting. His eyes weren't piercing like the bullies had been. They weren't filled with mockery or judgment. They were steady, kind, and above all, understanding. Thank you, Leo finally said, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be. Keanu gave him a small nod, the hint of a smile touching the corners of his lips. No need to thank me, he said, his voice as calm and grounded as it had been when he had told the bullies to stop. You didn't deserve that. Leo looked down at his sketchbook, feeling a lump form in his throat. They always do that. They say I'm weird because I like drawing, because I don't talk much. Keanu exhaled slowly, as if he understood far more than he was letting on. He knelt down slightly, lowering himself so that he was at Leo's level once again. It was a small gesture, but it made all the difference. He wasn't towering over him, wasn't speaking down to him. He was meeting him where he was, as if to say, I see you. You know, Keanu said, when I was your age, I was the quiet kid too. I moved around a lot, didn't always fit in. People didn't always get me. Leo's eyes widened slightly. It was hard to imagine someone like Keanu Reeves, someone who played the toughest, coolest characters on screen, ever being anything like him. Really? Keanu nodded. Yeah. I wasn't great at school. Had a hard time making friends. I got bullied too. He paused, then chuckled softly. Didn't have a sketchbook though. Maybe I should have. For the first time that day, Leo smiled. It was small, hesitant, but it was there. I draw because it makes me feel like I'm somewhere else, he admitted. Like, if I put something on paper, it's real. Even if it's not real here. Keanu studied the sketchbook again, then looked back at Leo. That's not weird. That's talent. And it's yours. Don't let them take that from you. The words hit Leo in a way he wasn't prepared for. He had heard adults say things like ignore them or don't let it get to you before, but this was different. This wasn't someone dismissing what he felt or telling him to simply walk away. This was someone who understood, who had been there, who knew what it was like, and that made all the difference. Behind them, the park had started to return to its usual rhythm, though there was still an unmistakable buzz in the air. People had started whispering, some cautiously pulling out their phones. A few had recognized Keanu earlier, but now the murmurs were growing. Is that really him? I think he just stood up for that kid. Did someone get that on camera? A woman sitting on a nearby bench had already started recording, her phone angled discreetly. She wasn't the only one. A few others, mostly teenagers, were now holding their phones up, their eyes wide with excitement. It wasn't every day that a Hollywood star walked into a park and intervened in a bullying incident. The moment was already starting to take on a life of its own. Keanu, however, didn't seem to notice or care. His focus remained on Leo, who was still clutching his sketchbook like it was a shield. Keanu could see the boy's mind racing, as if debating whether or not to say something else. Finally, Leo took a breath. Do you really think I'm good?" he asked, his voice almost fragile. Keanu's gaze softened even more. He reached out and gently tapped the cover of the sketchbook. "I don't think it. I know it." The words settled in Leo's chest, warming something that had been cold for a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like just another target for kids to push around. He felt seen. The bullies who had once surrounded him were still nearby, though they had retreated slightly, standing in awkward silence. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't taunting. One of them, the tallest one, looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't seem to find the words. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was something else. Keanu glanced at them briefly before standing up. He didn't say anything to them directly, but his message had already been received. The weight of what had just happened was still sinking in. Leo wasn't the only one who would walk away from this moment changed. Keanu gave one last nod to Leo before turning. He had done what he came to do. He had stepped in when no one else had, and now it was time to let the moment settle. He wasn't the type to linger in the spotlight, not even in moments like these. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because as he walked away, Leo watched him go, something sparking inside him. He had spent most of his life keeping his head down, making himself small, hoping that if he just stayed quiet, the world wouldn't hurt him too much. But now, for the first time, he felt something different. Maybe he didn't have to be invisible. Maybe he didn't have to stay silent. And maybe, just maybe, the world had just witnessed the moment everything changed. What neither Leo nor Keanu knew at that moment was that by the time the sun set, the video of their encounter would have already started spreading across the internet. And by the next morning, the world would be watching. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the city skyline. Streetlights flickered to life, neon signs buzzed, and the distant hum of traffic filled the night air. In a quiet apartment, Leo sat cross-legged on his bed, his sketchbook open in front of him. The pages were filled with the same intricate worlds he had always created: fantastical cities, strange creatures, and heroes who stood tall against the odds. But tonight, his hands were still. The pencil between his fingers hadn't moved in minutes. His mind wasn't in his sketchbook. It was still in the park. The moment kept replaying in his head. The bullies, the humiliation, and then him. Keanu Reeves had stepped in like some kind of guardian from another world, turning the entire situation upside down with just a few calm words. The way he had looked at Leo's artwork, the way he had spoken to him, had done something no teacher, no counselor, no well-meaning adult had ever been able to do. He had made Leo feel like his art, like he mattered. Leo glanced at his phone, which buzzed with another notification. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen. The video. The one someone had taken in the park. It had been uploaded hours ago, and now it was everywhere. His heart pounded as he saw the numbers. Over 2 million views. His stomach flipped. He scrolled through the comments, his breath catching at the flood of responses. Keanu Reeves is the hero we don't deserve. This is why I love this man. He always stands up for the little guy. The kid's artwork looks amazing. Does he have an Instagram? We need to find this kid and support his art. Leo's mouth went dry. People were talking about him. Him, not just Keanu. Strangers from all over the world were asking about his drawings, praising him, wanting to know more. He felt his pulse in his ears, his brain struggling to process it all. He had spent so much of his life trying to stay unseen, but now the world was looking straight at him. He had never felt so exposed. His mom's voice came from the hallway. Leo. He jolted, slamming the phone face down onto his bed. Yeah. She peeked into his room, concern etched into her features. She was still in her work uniform, looking exhausted from another long shift. Have you seen what's happening online? Leo hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. She stepped inside, sitting at the edge of his bed. It's crazy, huh? She smiled, but there was something uncertain in her expression. I mean, you're all over the internet. People are talking about you. Leo swallowed hard. I know. She reached out and brushed a stray curl from his forehead, the way she always did when she was worried about him. How do you feel about it? That was the question, wasn't it? How did he feel? He wasn't sure. Part of him was excited, buzzing with the kind of energy he had never felt before. Another part of him was terrified. This wasn't just some school rumor spreading through the hallways. This was the internet. This was millions of people. What if the bullies at school saw it? What if people thought he was weak for needing Keanu Reeves to step in? What if this attention didn't last, and he went back to being invisible? I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. His mom nodded, like she understood. Well, she said, squeezing his hand, just know that no matter what happens, I'm proud of you. Leo looked down at their hands, then back at her. For what? I didn't do anything. Yes, you did. She smiled. You didn't give up on yourself. And now, people are finally seeing what I've always known. You're special. Leo wanted to believe her. He really did. But the next morning, the reality of the situation hit in full force. The moment he walked into school, everyone was staring at him. Whispers filled the hallways. People who had never spoken to him before were suddenly watching his every move, some with wide eyes, others with barely hidden curiosity. He caught bits and pieces of conversations as he passed. That's the kid from the video. He met Keanu Reeves, dude. Can you imagine? Do you think he'll be on the news? Leo hunched his shoulders, gripping his backpack straps tightly. He wasn't used to this. He had spent so long being the kid who blended into the background, the one no one noticed unless they wanted to pick on him. But now the same kids who used to ignore him were whispering his name like he was something rare and new. When he reached his locker, a voice cut through the chatter. Yo, Leo the legend. Leo stiffened. That voice. He turned slowly to see Mark, the same boy who had stolen his sketchbook the day before, striding toward him with an obnoxious grin. His usual group of friends trailed behind, but something about them was different today. There was no taunting in their faces, no cruelty. Instead, they looked unsure, like they weren't sure how to act now that the world had seen what had happened. Leo's stomach twisted. Mark leaned against the locker next to his, arms crossed. Man, you really blew up. Leo didn't answer. He just focused on putting his books away, hoping, praying, that Mark would get bored and leave. But Mark wasn't done. So, what's it like? You gonna be famous now or something? Maybe Keanu's gonna take you to Hollywood. He chuckled, nudging one of his friends. Dude, imagine if this kid ends up in a movie. Leo's fingers clenched around his book. He could hear the mocking edge in Mark's voice, even if it was more subtle than usual. The attention hadn't humbled him. If anything, it had just made him more desperate to stay relevant. "Maybe you could draw something cool for me," Mark continued. "Since, you're such a big deal now." Leo turned then, slowly, meeting Mark's gaze, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. Because now he wasn't alone. Now he had people standing behind him. He took a deep breath and said, "I don't draw for people like you." Mark's smirk faltered. His friends exchanged glances, the tension shifting between them. This wasn't the response they had expected. The old Leo, the one who never spoke up, who kept his head down, would have mumbled something and walked away. But this Leo, he stood firm. Mark scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Whatever, man." But there was something hollow in his voice, something uncertain. Leo didn't look away. He didn't back down. And eventually, Mark did. As the older boy walked away, Leo let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart was racing, his palms sweaty, but something inside him had changed. Keanu had given him confidence, but Leo had chosen to use it. That was the real victory. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur. Leo barely had time to process everything that was happening before another wave of attention crashed over him. His name was on every social media platform. His face was in YouTube thumbnails, next to Keanu Reeves in bold text. "Hollywood star saves kid from bullies." There were reaction videos, news articles, and even fan art of him and Keanu. It was surreal. At first, it felt like a dream, like he had stepped into some alternate reality where he wasn't just some invisible kid drawing in the corner of the classroom. People were reaching out to him online, sending messages filled with kindness and encouragement. Artists were offering to mentor him, and strangers were telling him how much they loved his work. But with that attention came something else, the weight of expectation. It started small, little things, like people assuming he had become best friends with Keanu overnight, or that he was about to be launched into some incredible career because of the video. Some even joked that he should be in John Wick 5. Others messaged him, asking for autographs, as if he had become some kind of celebrity overnight. Then, there were the skeptics. "This feels staged. Keanu always has these random moments caught on camera. Too convenient. I bet this kid is exaggerating how bad the bullying was just to get attention." Great, another viral nobody who'll be forgotten in a week. Leo had never really cared what people thought about him before, mostly because no one had bothered to have an opinion about him at all. But now, he wasn't just some kid drawing in the background. He was a story, and stories were picked apart, debated, judged. At school, the attention was just as overwhelming. His teachers pulled him aside, telling him how proud they were. A few even asked if he would talk to the younger students about bullying. Kids who had never spoken to him before suddenly wanted to sit next to him at lunch, and the ones who used to ignore him now greeted him in the halls like they were old friends. But it didn't feel real. Because under all of that, he knew what was really happening. He had seen it before, how people treated viral sensations like fleeting trends. One day, they were everywhere, and the next, forgotten. Leo wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The only place that still felt normal was home. His mom tried to keep things grounded, making sure he wasn't getting lost in the chaos. She had even helped him sort through the flood of messages on social media, setting up a private account for his artwork so he wouldn't have to deal with the overwhelming attention on his personal one. But something still felt off, and it only got worse when the call came. It was late evening, and Leo was sitting at the dining table, sketching absent-mindedly while his mom scrolled through emails. The news had started reaching out to them. Morning shows, talk shows, even a documentary-style YouTube channel that wanted to feature him. That was when her phone rang. Leo wasn't paying attention at first. He was too busy shading the folds of a character's jacket, trying to get the lighting just right. But then he heard her voice change. "Wait, you mean him?" Leo looked up. His mom's eyes were wide, her fingers gripping the phone a little tighter. She listened for another moment, then glanced at him. "He's right here. Let me put you on speaker." Leo set his pencil down as she tapped the screen, and then, "Hey, kid." His breath caught. He knew that voice. He had heard it in movies, interviews, and just days ago in the park. Keanu Reeves. Leo's brain short-circuited. Hi. He stammered, his voice embarrassingly high-pitched. Keanu chuckled. "Didn't mean to catch you off guard." Leo's mom leaned forward, smiling at him. "They reached out," she whispered. "Keanu's team. He wanted to talk to you." Leo's hands felt clammy as he wiped them on his jeans. Wow, I wasn't expecting this." Keanu's voice was as calm and steady as ever. "Didn't think I'd leave you hanging, did you?" Leo swallowed hard. "I don't know. You're you. You probably have way more important stuff to do." Keanu let out a soft laugh. "Maybe. But I wanted to check in on you. Things have been pretty crazy, huh?" Leo exhaled sharply. "Yeah, a little." Keanu paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "Listen, kid, I know what it's like to have a spotlight suddenly thrown on you. It's weird, isn't it?" Leo nodded before realizing Keanu couldn't see him. "Yeah," he said quickly. "It's really weird." "You okay?" Keanu asked. The question caught him off guard. People had been congratulating him, praising him, asking him for things. But no one had really asked that. Leo hesitated. I don't know. It's a lot." "I get it," Keanu said. "People love stories. They love moments. But sometimes they forget that there's a person at the center of it all." Leo's throat tightened. "Yeah." Keanu exhaled on the other end. "I just wanted to tell you. You don't owe anybody anything. Not the internet, not the people at school, not even me." Leo blinked. "But you helped me. And now everyone's paying attention to me because of you." Keanu chuckled. "Nah, kid. They're paying attention because of you. You stood your ground. You didn't let them break you. That's all you." Leo looked down at his sketchbook, his fingers brushing over the page. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." "You don't have to do anything," Keanu said simply. "Just keep being you. Keep drawing. Keep doing what makes you happy. The world will move on to the next big thing eventually. That's how this works. But that doesn't change who you are." Leo let those words sink in. He had been so caught up in the chaos of everything that he had started to lose sight of himself. He had been afraid that once the world moved on, he would fade away again. But Keanu was right. Even if the internet forgot about him, even if his classmates lost interest, he would still be here. He would still have his art, his stories, the things that made him him. And that was enough. Leo took a deep breath, something inside him settling for the first time in days. "Thanks," he said softly, "for everything." Keanu's voice was warm. "Anytime, kid." And just like that, the call ended. Leo stared at his phone for a long moment before finally picking up his pencil again. He turned to a fresh page in his sketchbook, the blank space filled with possibility. He wasn't drawing to impress anyone. He wasn't drawing because people were expecting him to. He was drawing because he loved it, because this was who he was. And no viral moment, no fleeting internet fame, could ever take that away from him. The days following Leo's call with Keanu Reeves were calmer, but the storm wasn't over. If anything, it had only shifted. The world had seen him, held him up for a moment, and now it was beginning to move on. At school, the attention was still there, but it was starting to change. The initial awe was wearing off, replaced by something else. Expectation. People kept asking him what he was going to do next. Was he going to meet Keanu again? Was he going to get interviewed by a famous talk show? Was he planning to make a comic book or start a YouTube channel? Leo didn't know how to answer any of them. The truth was, he didn't have a next big thing planned. He was just trying to exist, trying to go back to the way things were before the video, before the stares, before people suddenly cared. But there was no going back. Even his art felt different now. Before, drawing had been his escape. It was his way of creating a world where he was in control, where he could be whoever he wanted to be. Now, every time he picked up his pencil, he felt an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. What if what he drew wasn't good enough anymore? What if people expected something greater from him now? What if, after all this, he wasn't actually special? The anxiety built inside him like a slow-burning fire, creeping into every moment of his day. He started drawing less, spending more time mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Every time he opened social media, he saw another post about him. More videos, more opinions, more people talking about him like he was some kind of character in a story instead of a real person. Then, the shift happened. It was gradual at first. Fewer mentions, fewer messages. His name wasn't trending anymore. The comments under the original viral video change, with newer ones saying things like, "Oh, this is old news. Why do people care so much about this kid? Keanu is cool, but the internet hypes up anything these days." It was happening, just like Keanu had said it would. The world was moving on. Leo should have felt relieved. He had wanted the attention to fade, hadn't he? But instead, all he felt was an aching emptiness. The worst part wasn't the world moving on. It was the people at school who moved on with it. The same kids who had suddenly wanted to talk to him, who had sat with him at lunch and followed his art page, were now pretending he didn't exist again. Some of them still nodded at him in the hallways, but the enthusiasm was gone. They had gotten what they wanted from him, the excitement of knowing someone viral. Now he was just Leo again, and for the first time in his life, being invisible hurt. The worst moment came when he overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. It was during lunch, and he had just stepped into the cafeteria when he caught his name in the air. He turned instinctively, his stomach twisting when he saw Mark, his old bully, sitting with a group of kids. They hadn't noticed him standing nearby. "I told you," Mark was saying, smirking. "It's over. People are already getting bored of him." One of the other kids, a boy named Jason, leaned in. But for a minute, he was everywhere. "You really think he didn't milk it?" Mark snorted. "Dude, come on." He got lucky. Keanu Reeves showed up. And now he thinks he's somebody. Watch. Next month, no one will even remember his name. Leo felt something crack inside him. He turned and walked out of the cafeteria before anyone could see the way his hands were shaking. By the time he got home that afternoon, he felt drained, like all the energy had been sucked out of him. He ignored his mom's questions, muttering something about being tired before locking himself in his room. He sat on his bed, staring at his sketchbook. He wanted to draw. He wanted to lose himself in his worlds, in his characters, in the one thing that had always made him feel whole. But when he opened to a blank page, his mind stayed empty. No ideas came. No inspiration. Nothing. Frustrated, he tossed the sketchbook onto the floor and lay back, staring at the ceiling. He had thought the worst part of being invisible was feeling unnoticed. But now he realized. The worst part was knowing what it felt like to be seen, only to have it taken away. Lost in the silence. The days passed in a dull haze, each one blending into the next. Leo moved through school like a ghost, barely speaking, barely existing beyond the routine of waking up, sitting through classes, and going home. The buzz around him had fully died. He was no longer that kid from the Keanu video. He was just Leo again, except now, being Leo felt worse than before. He had tried drawing again, but every time he picked up a pencil, doubt crept in. He would stare at the blank page for minutes, hours sometimes, but nothing came. His mind, once overflowing with stories and characters, now felt like a vast, empty space. It was as if the pressure of being seen, of being expected to be something more, had crushed whatever magic he once had. At school, the kids who had once eagerly crowded around him had moved on. The cafeteria table where he had briefly been welcome was once again off limits. He sat alone again, except this time. The loneliness felt sharper, heavier. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about knowing that, for a brief moment, he had mattered to them, only to be discarded the moment his relevance faded. He stopped checking his messages. The flood of support had slowed to a trickle, and the few messages that did come in felt hollow. "Hey man, you still drawing? Dude, you should totally do a comic about your story. So do you still talk to Keanu?" It was always the same. No one actually cared how he was doing. They just wanted the story to continue. They wanted him to be something for them. And the ones who weren't interested in him anymore, they had simply erased him. Mark and his friends didn't even bother with him now. In some ways, that was worse than the bullying. At least back then, they had acknowledged him, even if it was in the worst way possible. Now he was nothing. The worst part was that he didn't even feel angry about it. He just felt empty. The silence was unbearable, but Leo didn't know how to break it. One evening, his mom knocked on his door and stepped in quietly, holding a mug of hot chocolate, his favorite. She placed it on his desk and sat on the edge of his bed, watching him carefully. "You haven't been yourself lately," she said gently. Leo just shrugged. She sighed. "I know things got overwhelming, and I know it feels like everything just disappeared overnight. But honey, you're still you. You were never just that video. You were never just that kid Keanu Reeves helped. You are Leo, my son, the artist, the dreamer. That hasn't changed." Leo stared at his hands, guilt gnawing at him. He wanted to believe her, but he didn't feel like himself anymore. He didn't know who he was supposed to be. His mom reached out and took his hand. "Do you want to talk to him?" Leo looked up. "Who?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Keanu." His stomach twisted. He hadn't talked to Keanu since their phone call. He had convinced himself that Keanu had done enough, that he shouldn't bother him. But now, sitting in this emptiness, part of him wondered, did Keanu know this feeling? Had he ever felt like this before? He hesitated, then slowly nodded. His mom squeezed his hand and got up. "I'll reach out to his team. See if he has time for a chat." Leo didn't get his hopes up. Keanu was Keanu Reeves. He had a life, a career, real things to do. But still, a tiny part of him clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, Keanu would understand. Days passed before anything happened. Then, one evening, his mom walked into his room with a smile. "He's free for a call." Leo's heart pounded. Minutes later, his phone rang. He picked it up and took a deep breath before answering. "Hello." "Hey, kid." Keanu's voice came through, warm and steady. "How are you holding up?" Leo hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I don't know." Keanu was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let me guess. First, everything felt too big. Now, it feels like you're disappearing." Leo's throat tightened. "Yeah." Keanu sighed. "I know that feeling, kid. I've been there." Leo blinked. "You have?" Keanu chuckled. "Oh yeah, you think going viral is weird. Try being in a blockbuster movie at 25 and having the whole world suddenly expect you to be someone you're not." Leo swallowed. "How did you deal with it?" There was another pause. Then Keanu said, "I had to remember why I started. Why I loved acting in the first place. It wasn't for the fame. It wasn't for the attention. It was because I loved it. But when the world starts watching, it's easy to forget that. You start feeling like you have to perform for them instead of doing it for yourself." Leo closed his eyes, understanding the words more than he wanted to. Keanu continued, "So let me ask you something, kid. Before all of this, before the video, before the attention, why did you draw?" Leo hesitated, Because I love it. Because it makes me feel free. Then don't let them take that from you, Keanu said softly. Forget the internet. Forget the kids at school. Forget all of it. Just draw. Not for them. For you. Leo felt a lump in his throat. He had let the pressure steal that from him. He had let them take something that had always belonged to him. Keanu's voice was gentle. You don't owe the world a performance, kid. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just do what you love. And if people forget you, let them. You were never doing this for them in the first place. Leo gripped the phone tighter. But what if I don't know how to start again? Keanu chuckled. One line at a time. Leo took a shaky breath. Okay. They talked for a little longer, but when the call ended, something felt different. The emptiness wasn't gone, but it wasn't as overwhelming. Leo looked at his sketchbook, still untouched on his desk. Slowly, he walked over and picked it up. He turned to a blank page, took a deep breath, and put his pencil to the paper. One line, then another, and another. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about what anyone else would say. He was just drawing. For himself. And it felt right. A new chapter. The sound of the pencil against paper was soft but steady, like the gentle rhythm of rain against a window. For the first time in weeks, Leo wasn't overthinking. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't worrying about what anyone else thought. He was just drawing. Really drawing. At first, it felt unfamiliar, like he had forgotten how to let himself enjoy it. His fingers were stiff, his strokes hesitant, but he kept going, one line at a time. And slowly, something shifted. His breathing steadied. The knot in his chest loosened. The images in his head, once buried under self-doubt and expectation, started to come back to life. He didn't think about whether this drawing would impress anyone. He didn't think about social media or viral videos or the kids at school. He just let himself be. It was late when he finally set his pencil down and looked at what he had created. A new character stared back at him from the page. It wasn't one of his usual superheroes or fantasy warriors. This one was different. A boy standing at the edge of a vast city, looking out at the world ahead. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't larger than life. He was just a kid, small, uncertain, but ready. Leo traced his fingers over the lines. This was him. The next morning, Leo woke up feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The emptiness wasn't completely gone, but it didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. He had found something again, something that had always been his. He didn't expect anything to change overnight. He knew the kids at school wouldn't suddenly treat him differently. He knew Mark and his friends would still ignore him. He knew the internet had already moved on, but none of that mattered as much anymore. At lunch, he sat at his usual table, alone, but okay with it. He pulled out his sketchbook, flipping through the pages, letting himself feel again. And then something unexpected happened. Hey. Leo looked up. It was Maya, one of the few people at school who had actually been nice to him before everything happened. She hesitated, then gestured to the seat across from him. Can I sit? Leo nodded, a little surprised. She set down her tray, glancing at his sketchbook. Are you working on something new? He hesitated for only a second before turning the book toward her. Yeah. It's not finished yet, but... Maya studied the drawing, a small smile forming. This is cool. I like the way you did the background, like the city is huge compared to him. Leo felt a warmth in his chest. It wasn't the exaggerated excitement people had shown when the video first went viral. It wasn't the fake admiration from kids who just wanted to be near him for attention. It was real. Maya wasn't here because of Keanu Reeves. She wasn't here because he had been trending on the internet. She was here because she genuinely liked his art. Thanks, Leo said, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Over the next few weeks, Leo kept drawing, not for anyone else, but for himself. He started posting his art again, but this time, He didn't care how many likes it got. He didn't chase validation. He just shared. And something amazing happened. A small community formed around his work, not because he was the viral kid, but because they actually loved his stories, his characters, his art. Some people even asked if he was going to make a full comic. Maybe he would. One evening, as Leo was finishing up a new sketch, his phone buzzed. It was a message. "Keanu, heard you're back at it. Proud of you, kid. Keep creating." Leo smiled. The world had moved on from his story. But that was okay. Because his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he was writing it his way.